The rain hammered against the penthouse windows as Daniel Matthews stood over his pregnant wife, his face twisted with contempt rather than concern. He was unaware his pregnant wife was a secret trillionaire who owned the company his mother worked for, believing instead that Emma was nothing more than the broke orphan he'd married out of pity 3 years ago. His hands trembled, not with remorse, but with anticipation, as he threw her out in the rain to marry his secretary, the woman who'd been feeding his ego while Emma carried his child. His mother, Patricia Matthews, a mid-level manager who bragged endlessly about her important position, stood behind him with crossed arms, her lips curled in satisfaction rather than sympathy. What his mother didn't know was that every paycheck she deposited, every promotion she celebrated, every corner office she occupied came from the empire Emma had built from nothing after her adoptive parents died. The secretary, Monica Reeves, watched from the doorway with a smile that promised passion but delivered only calculation. Her engagement ring already picked out while Emma's wedding band grew tight around her swollen fingers. Dear viewers, this powerful story will open your eyes to the hidden dangers of judging people by their silence and treating kindness as weakness. You'll discover how to recognize when someone is secretly manipulating you, understand the devastating difference between justice and revenge, and learn why the quietest person in your life might be the strongest. This story will challenge everything you think you know about power, marriage, and consequences. What lessons did you take from Emma's journey? If you were in her shoes, would you have done things differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more captivating stories that entertain, educate, and inspire. The penthouse had always felt too large for just 2 people, but tonight it felt suffocating despite its 3,000 square feet of marble and glass. Emma Richardson stood in the living room she'd designed, though Daniel believed his decorator friend had done it, her hand pressed protectively against the swell of her belly where their daughter kicked with increasing urgency, as if sensing her mother's rising heartbeat. The rain had started exactly at 8:47 p.m., just as the weather forecast Emma had checked obsessively all week had predicted. But the storm inside their home had been building for far longer than any meteorologist could have charted. Daniel Matthews paced in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection multiplying in the glass like accusations. His jaw clenched in that particular way that meant he'd rehearsed this conversation but feared he'd lose his nerve. He was handsome in the conventional way that came from good genes rather than good character. Sharp jawline, athletic build maintained by a personal trainer Emma paid for through an account he never questioned. Hair styled by a barber whose tips alone cost more than most people's car payments. But tonight his handsomeness was corrupted by something ugly beneath the surface, like fruit rotting from the inside out, while the skin remained perfect. "I can't do this anymore," he said finally, his voice carrying the false firmness of a man who'd practiced this line in the mirror, but didn't truly believe his own conviction. You're dragging me down, Emma. I need someone who understands ambition, who can actually contribute something to this relationship besides cooking and cleaning." Emma said nothing, but her fingers tightened imperceptibly on her phone, the encrypted device that looked like any other smartphone but contained access to bank accounts with balances that would make Daniel's head spin. She'd known this moment was coming for 6 weeks, ever since she'd found the hotel receipt carelessly left in his suit pocket, the same suit she'd had dry cleaned and returned to his closet without comment. The receipt had been from the Sterling Hotel, ironic since Emma owned a controlling stake in the parent company, and had been charged to their joint credit card, which was actually Emma's card with Daniel's name added as an authorized user. "I've met someone else," Daniel continued, warming to his script now, his confidence growing as Emma's silence stretched longer. "Someone who actually has a career, who understands what it takes to succeed in this world. Monica understands me in ways you never could." Monica Reeves stepped into the doorway then, as if summoned by the mention of her name, her timing too perfect to be coincidental. She'd clearly been listening from the hallway, waiting for her cue like an actress in a community theater production. She was beautiful in an obvious way, all long legs and calculated curves poured into a dress that cost exactly $347, Emma knew, because she'd seen the charge on Daniel's personal credit card last week and had traced it to a boutique in Soho. Monica's smile was triumphant but brittle, like sugar glass that would shatter at the slightest pressure. "Daniel and I are in love," Monica announced. as if love were a competition she just won, rather than an emotion she'd actually felt. We're going to get married as soon as the divorce is finalized. I'm pregnant too, by the way, 3 months along, so your little leverage is gone. Emma's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Not pain, not surprise, but the look of a chess player who'd just seen her opponent make exactly the move she'd anticipated. She'd known about Monica's pregnancy before Monica herself had taken the test, having had access to the medical records through the health insurance plan Emma's company provided to Daniel's firm. What Monica didn't know was that the baby she carried wasn't Daniel's. The timeline was impossible given Daniel's vasectomy reversal surgery 6 months ago, a surgery that hadn't fully taken yet, according to his most recent fertility test. Results Emma had received before Daniel had bothered to check his patient portal. "Mom!" Daniel called toward the staircase, his voice carrying a note of boyish excitement that made Emma's stomach turn. "Come down. It's time." Patricia Matthews descended the curved staircase with the bearing of a woman who believed she deserved better than what life had given her, her designer handbag, a gift from Emma 2 Christmases ago, swinging from her elbow as she gripped the railing with her other hand. She worked as a senior director at Meridian Enterprises, a position she'd held for 3 years, and considered the crowning achievement of her career, never suspecting that every promotion had been orchestrated by the daughter-in-law she'd spent those same 3 years openly despising. "Is it done?" Patricia asked Daniel, her eyes sliding over Emma with undisguised contempt. "Is the leech finally getting thrown out?" Emma finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady, carrying the weight of 3 years of accumulated observations and calculated patience. "Daniel, before you do this, I need to tell you something." But Patricia moved faster than Emma expected, closing the distance between them with surprising speed for a woman in 4-inch heels, her hand already rising in a motion that seemed to happen in slow motion and at lightning speed simultaneously. The spit hit Emma's face with the force of years of resentment, landing just below her left eye and sliding down her cheek like a tear made of malice. What happens in the 60 seconds after Patricia's spit lands on Emma's face? The phone call she makes, the words she speaks, the machine she sets in motion will unravel 3 lives so completely that within a week, they'll be begging for the mercy of the woman they just destroyed. Emma didn't wipe the spit from her face. She stood perfectly still, her expression unchanged, but her left hand moved with deliberate precision to her phone, while her right hand remained protectively over her belly. The rain intensified outside, hammering the windows with a violence that seemed to mirror the moment unfolding inside. But Emma's fingers were steady as they unlocked the screen and pulled up a contact labeled simply JK. "What are you doing?" Daniel asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty rather than authority, because something in Emma's stillness was more frightening than any screaming fit would have been. "Put the phone away, we're not done talking." But Emma was already pressing the call button, and when the line connected after just 1 ring, she spoke with a clarity that cut through the room like a blade. "Jonathan, it's ER Initiate Protocol 7, Authorization Code, Meridian Fall Crown Justice. Yes, all of them. Immediate execution." "Who the hell is Jonathan?" Monica demanded, her voice rising with an edge of panic she couldn't quite hide, because successful mistresses understood that unknown variables were dangerous variables. "What protocol? Daniel, who is she calling?" Emma ended the call. It had lasted exactly 9 seconds, and finally reached up to wipe Patricia's spit from her face with the back of her hand, the gesture slow and deliberate, as if she were wiping away the last remnant of any obligation she'd ever felt to these people. When she spoke, her voice carried a different quality than it had moments before. Not the soft, accommodating tone of Daniel's wife, but the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Jonathan Kim is the Chief Legal Officer of Richardson Global Holdings," Emma said, each word landing like a hammer strike. "Protocol 7 is the systematic legal and financial dissolution of all protective structures I've maintained for individuals who've proven themselves fundamentally unworthy of that protection. In simpler terms that you might understand, Daniel, I just removed every safety net I've been holding under you for 3 years." The room went silent except for the rain, which seemed to pound harder as if nature itself were punctuating Emma's words. Daniel's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, disbelief, the beginning of comprehension, and then a desperate attempt to laugh it off that died in his throat when he saw Emma's eyes. "What are you talking about?" he asked, but his voice had gone thin, stretched tight over growing fear. "Richardson Global. That's some company you're making up. You don't have any money. You told me your parents left you nothing when they died." "I told you my adoptive parents left me their debts when they died in a car accident," Emma corrected, her tone patient in the way a teacher might be patient with a particularly slow student. "That was true. What I didn't mention was that my biological parents, the ones who gave me up for adoption when they were teenagers, found me when I was 19. They were Rebecca and Thomas Richardson of Richardson Global Holdings, a privately held conglomerate with assets exceeding $3 trillion. They died in a private plane crash 6 months after we reconnected, leaving everything to me." Monica's face had gone pale, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach in a protective gesture that mirrored Emma's earlier motion. But where Emma's gesture had been natural, Monica's looked calculated even in her fear. "That's insane. Daniel, she's clearly having some kind of breakdown. Pregnant women get delusional sometimes." But Patricia's face had changed in a different way, the color draining out like water from a broken glass, because unlike Daniel and Monica, Patricia worked in corporate finance and understood exactly what Richardson Global Holdings was. She'd spent 15 years at Meridian Enterprises, a mid-sized financial services firm that handled investment portfolios for high-net-worth individuals, never knowing that Meridian itself was a wholly owned subsidiary of Richardson Global Holdings, never suspecting that the anonymous CEO who'd personally approved her last 3 promotions was the daughter-in-law whose face she just spit on. "No," Patricia whispered, the word barely audible over the rain. "That's not possible. Richardson Global. The owner is listed as E.R. Sterling. The E.R. stands for Emma Richardson," Emma finished. "Sterling was my adoptive parents' surname. I kept it for business purposes because people don't take 22-year-old billionaires seriously, but they'll listen to a mysterious entity hidden behind lawyers and corporate structures. Meridian Enterprises, Patricia, the company you're so proud to work for? I own it. The corner office you celebrated getting last year? I'm the one who approved your promotion. The salary you used to pay your mortgage, your car payment, your country club membership? Every dollar has come from me." Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket, once, twice, then continuously like an alarm he couldn't silence. Monica's phone started buzzing too, and then Patricia's, the 3 devices creating a discordant symphony that spoke of messages arriving faster than they could be read. But none of them moved to check their phones, because they were all staring at Emma with the dawning horror of people who just realized they'd been playing checkers while their opponent had been playing chess. "What did you do?" Daniel asked, his voice cracking on the last word. "What the hell did you just do?" Emma smiled for the first time that evening, but it wasn't the gentle smile Daniel had grown accustomed to over 3 years of marriage. It was the smile of a woman who just removed her mask and found the air underneath to be surprisingly liberating. "In 60 seconds, Emma said softly, moving toward the door and pulling her coat tighter around her pregnant belly. "I just took away everything you thought you owned." What would they find when they finally looked at their phones? The messages from banks, from employers, from lawyers. And would the next 24 hours show them that Emma's revenge was just beginning, or that she'd already finished it so completely that they'd been living in ruins without even knowing it? Daniel's hands shook as he finally pulled his phone from his pocket, the device vibrating so violently it nearly slipped from his grip. The screen was filled with notifications, emails, texts, automated alerts, each one a small explosion that together formed a devastating cascade. The first email he opened was from his bank, the subject line reading "Account Closure Notice" in aggressive capital letters that seemed to shout his financial death sentence. "This can't be right," he muttered, scrolling frantically through message after message, each one worse than the last. "The investment account. It says the account never existed. The car loan shows the vehicle was never actually titled in my name. The condo," his voice broke completely. "The condo I bought downtown, the one I was going to move into with Monica. It says the purchase was declined due to insufficient funds, But I put down $200,000 last week. Emma paused at the door, her hand on the handle, but she didn't turn around. You mean the $200,000 from the joint account that wasn't actually joint? She asked, her voice carrying across the room with crystalline clarity despite the rain. The account I opened in your name and funded myself because you came into this marriage with $37,000 in credit card debt and a car that was 2 payments from repossession? That money was returned to its rightful account 7 minutes ago. The condo purchase never went through because the seller just discovered the property is actually owned by a shell corporation that's owned by another shell corporation that's ultimately owned by Richardson Global Holdings. I bought that building 3 years ago. You were essentially trying to buy a condo from me using my own money. Monica's phone had stopped buzzing, but her face suggested the silence was worse than the noise. She stared at her screen with the expression of someone watching their entire future collapse in real time. My job, she whispered. Daniel, my job. They're saying my employment was terminated effective immediately due to falsification of credentials and misappropriation of company resources. But I didn't falsify anything. You didn't falsify your degree from Stanford, Emma agreed, finally turning to face them, her silhouette backlit by the hallway light in a way that made her seem larger than her 5'6" frame. But you did take credit for 17 projects that were actually completed by other team members. You did charge $43,000 in personal expenses to the company card over the last 8 months. You did access confidential client files without authorization and share that information with competitors. I know this because I own the security firm that monitors your company's digital activity. Every keystroke, every email, every file transfer, all documented and now forwarded to the appropriate authorities. Patricia had gone completely white, her perfectly applied makeup now standing out starkly against her drained complexion, like war paint on a losing soldier. Her phone had finally stopped buzzing, but she held it away from her body as if it were contaminated. My pension, she said, her voice hollow. 23 years at Meridian Enterprises. They're saying my pension doesn't exist. They're saying I was never vested, that I was actually classified as a contracted consultant, not a full employee. That's incorrect, Emma said, and for a moment something that might have been sympathy flickered across her face before hardening back into cold resolve. You were a full employee. Your pension was fully vested as of 2 years ago. $1.7 million, not counting the additional performance bonuses I personally authorized, but contracted consultants can be terminated without cause and without severance. As of 18 minutes ago, Meridian Enterprises restructured its entire senior management team. You weren't fired, Patricia. Your position was simply reclassified retroactively to reflect what I've now determined to be your actual value to the organization. You can't do that, Patricia said, but her voice carried no conviction. Because she worked in finance and knew exactly what legal structures existed for people with enough money and motivation. There are laws against that. I'll sue. I'll take you for everything you have. Emma's laugh was soft but contained an edge that could cut glass. With what money will you sue me, Patricia? The retainer for the lawyer you'd need costs more than your house is worth. And speaking of your house, the one you bought 15 years ago, the one you've been so proud of because it's in the right neighborhood, the mortgage was sold to a new lender approximately 12 minutes ago. The new payment schedule reflects current market interest rates rather than the below market rate you'd been paying. Your monthly payment just increased from $2,800 to $7,300. The first payment under the new terms is due in 17 days. Daniel's phone buzzed again, a single sharp notification that seemed to pierce through the room despite the storm outside. He looked at the screen and his knees actually buckled, forcing him to grab the back of the sofa for support. My startup, he breathed. The tech company I've been building for 2 years. The investors, they're all pulling out simultaneously. They're saying the patents I was developing were actually already filed by Richardson Technologies, a subsidiary of Richardson Global Holdings. They're saying I was committing corporate espionage by trying to patent technology that was already owned by someone else. You weren't committing espionage, Emma corrected gently, almost kindly. You were working on genuinely innovative ideas. I was just working on the same ideas faster and filing the patents first. I've been funding your angel investors this whole time, Daniel. Every pitch meeting you thought you won on merit, I was on the other end of the line, listening through conference calls, deciding whether your ideas were worth protecting. Some of them were. Those patents are now safely owned by my company, where they'll actually be developed properly rather than languishing in your garage while you play entrepreneur. Monica had started crying, not the delicate tears of a woman who cried prettily, but the ugly, gasping sobs of someone experiencing genuine terror. "What do you want?" she demanded between sobs. "What do we have to do to fix this? There has to be something. Money, an apology, something." Emma opened the door, letting in a gust of rain-scented air that carried the smell of wet concrete and urban ozone, the scent of a city being washed clean. "I don't want anything from you," she said simply. "I wanted a husband who loved me, a mother-in-law who respected me, and the chance to raise my daughter in a family that valued more than money and status. You've made it clear none of those things were ever possible, so now I just want you to understand something very important." She stepped into the hallway, one hand on her belly, where her daughter kicked with what felt like approval, her other hand pulling the door closed behind her with the finality of a vault ceiling shut. "The meek wife you threw away?" Emma's voice carried back through the narrowing gap. "She was never meek. She was just waiting to see if you deserved her mercy." The door clicked shut with a sound like a judge's gavel falling. What would the next morning bring when they woke to find their world completely dismantled? And would Daniel finally understand that the woman he'd married wasn't the victim of his cruelty, but the architect of his entire existence? And when Emma's own reckoning came, would she find that revenge had cost her more than she'd ever planned to pay? 3 weeks later, Emma sat in the corner office of Richardson Global Holdings, the office she'd occupied for 8 years but had visited only after dark or on weekends during her marriage, watching the sunrise paint Manhattan in shades of gold and amber that seemed too beautiful for the devastation she'd orchestrated. Her daughter kicked insistently against her ribs, a reminder that some things move forward regardless of the wreckage left behind. But Emma's hand on her belly felt less protective now and more apologetic, as if she were already asking forgiveness for the father her daughter would never know. The reports on her desk told a story more complete than any revenge fantasy she'd imagined during those long nights lying next to Daniel, wondering if tomorrow would be the day he finally remembered to ask about her dreams. Meridian Enterprises had restructured entirely, with Patricia's position eliminated along with 47 others in what the press called routine optimization, but Emma knew was calculated dismantling. Daniel's startup had dissolved, his reputation in the tech community destroyed not by Emma's revelations, but by his investors' public statements expressing concerns about foundational integrity. Corporate speak that meant everyone now suspected him of being either incompetent or fraudulent. Monica faced criminal charges for the expense account fraud, charges Emma could have prevented with a single phone call, but chose not to make. But the victory tasted like ash, exactly as her lawyer Jonathan Kim had warned it would. "They're requesting a meeting," Jonathan said from the doorway, his expression neutral in that carefully constructed way lawyers perfected when they disagreed with their clients but remained professionally obligated to represent them. "All three of them together. Daniel says he has something you need to hear about your daughter." Emma's hand tightened on her belly, maternal instinct overriding strategic calculation for just a moment before she forced herself back to coldness. "He gave up the right to discuss my daughter when he chose his secretary over his wife," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction she'd felt 3 weeks ago when everything had been theoretical rather than real. "He knows," Jonathan said quietly, "about the medical records, about the fact that Monica's baby isn't his, about the vasectomy reversal that hasn't taken. He's figured out that you've known everything from the beginning, that you've been watching and documenting and preparing. He's not angry about the money, Emma. He's angry that you let him destroy himself when you could have stopped it." The words landed like physical blows because they carried a truth Emma had been avoiding since the night she'd walked out of the penthouse into the rain. The rain that had soaked through her designer coat and ruined her Italian leather shoes, but had felt like baptism, like washing away 3 years of pretending to be someone smaller than she was. She'd told herself she was teaching them a lesson about consequences, about valuing people for their character rather than their bank accounts. But Jonathan's words suggested a different interpretation, one that made Emma's stomach turn with something that felt uncomfortably like shame. Had she married Daniel as some kind of experiment? Had she used him to prove something about human nature? That people would inevitably choose status over substance? That even love couldn't survive the corrosive power of entitlement and contempt? Or had she genuinely loved him once and only developed these justifications afterward, when love had curdled into something darker? "Send them in," Emma heard herself say, the words coming from some part of her that apparently believed reconciliation might still be possible, or at least that witnessing their destruction up close might provide the satisfaction that viewing it from a distance had failed to deliver. Daniel entered first, and Emma barely recognized him. 3 weeks had carved years into his face, hollowing his cheeks and putting shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and the kind of stress that aged a person from the inside out. He'd lost weight, his expensive suit hanging loosely on a frame that had always been maintained by privilege rather than discipline. But it was his eyes that shocked Emma most. They held something she'd never seen there before, something that looked almost like self-awareness. "I deserve this," he said, the words simple and unadorned by excuses or justifications, which made them more powerful than any elaborate apology could have been. "Everything you did, I earned it. But Emma, our daughter, doesn't deserve to grow up thinking her father is the monster you've made me into. Because that's what you've done, isn't it? You didn't just punish me for who I was. You destroyed any possibility that I could ever become someone better." Patricia entered behind him, her designer clothes replaced by department store separates, her hair showing gray roots that suggested she'd missed her regular salon appointment or couldn't afford it anymore. The woman who'd spit on Emma's face now couldn't meet her eyes, but when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that demanded attention despite its quietness. "I was wrong about you," Patricia said, each word seeming to cost her something valuable. "But you were wrong too. You married my son knowing exactly what he was, what I was, what all of us were. You documented our failures, collected our mistakes, prepared for this moment while pretending to be the victim. That's not justice, Emma. That's premeditation. That's cruelty dressed up as consequence." Monica stood in the doorway, visibly pregnant now, her belly smaller than Emma's but growing, carrying a child whose father was apparently a married executive who'd promised to leave his wife but had ghosted Monica the moment the fraud charges became public. She said nothing, but her presence felt like an accusation, a reminder that Emma's revenge had collateral damage, that destroying careers and reputations sent ripples outward to innocent people who'd never spit on anyone's face. Emma stood slowly, her own pregnancy making the movement awkward, and walked to the window where Manhattan stretched out below like a kingdom she ruled but had no desire to inhabit. The sun had fully risen now, harsh morning light replacing the gentle gold of dawn. And in that unforgiving illumination, Emma saw herself reflected in the glass, not as the wronged wife claiming justice, but as something more complicated and far less comfortable. "I could give it all back," she said quietly, speaking more to her reflection than to the people behind her. "Restore your jobs, your money, your reputations. I could make this all disappear as if it never happened. But would you have learned anything? Would you have changed, or would you just be more careful about who you underestimated next time?" "We'll never know," Daniel said, his voice carrying an edge of anger that felt more honest than anything else he'd said. "Because you took away our chance to choose differently. You decided you were judge, jury, and executioner. You decided that your pain mattered more than our possibility for growth. So congratulations, Emma. You won. You proved that the quiet person in the room can be the cruelest one. Is that the lesson you want our daughter to learn?" Emma turned from the window, her hand on her belly where her daughter kicked with increasing urgency. And for the first time since the night in the rain, she allowed herself to cry. Not the delicate tears of manipulation, but the ugly, wrenching sobs of someone confronting a truth they'd spent weeks avoiding. Revenge had left them bankrupt and regretful, exactly as she'd planned. But it had also left her hollow, alone, and facing the reality that the woman she'd become in pursuit of justice might be someone her daughter would one day fear rather than admire. The question wasn't whether they deserved what she'd done to them. The question was whether she deserved to become the person she'd had to become to do it. And as Emma looked at the three people who'd thrown her out in the rain, who'd spit on her face and celebrated her destruction, she realized that the cruelest lesson of all was the one she'd taught herself. That power without mercy doesn't feel like victory. It feels like losing in a different way,